Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the constitutional separation of powers and checks and balances. This is basically going to go through the standard stuff that the Constitution says the different branches of government can do and what's their primary purpose. Okay, number one, okay, so we're dealing with a problem. We've had federalism pop up. Um, State and national government, but now we're focusing really on the national government. How do you create a system that actually limits the power of the federal government? How do you prevent that monarch or chief executive from becoming too powerful? How do you check and balance? Okay. Well, if you're in Europe, there's actually a different method than if you're in the United States. This is called a parliamentary style government. So, in Europe, you'll get primarily parliamentary systems that exist. So in Europe, you have the voters because they're still a democratic government. The voters only elect one group of people, and that is the legislative branch. And the legislative branch in a parliamentary system is called parliament. It'd be like equal to our Congress. Now, the majority party, whoever wins that house, they get to select who the chief executive is. And in a parliamentary government, that's called a prime minister. The parliament also gets to appoint who the judiciary is going to be. So, what you find that in this system of government, part of how this person, the prime minister, the chief executive, is controlled is they are held accountable to the party that runs parliament. And the voters can always change out who's going to be in this parliament by election. But the voters don't actually vote for the executive. In this case, the voters only vote for the legislative, and the legislative chooses the executive. And what this means, of course, is if you win this house, you're getting whatever laws you want passed because there's no other side of that. There's no The only thing the opposition does is complain and moan and stuff. There's no, check or balance in that case. Now, in the United States, we have something known as a presidential system of government. So we have the voters here, but the voters conduct two separate elections. All right. One is to elect your legislative branch, that's the Congress. And number two is they elect the president, the executive branch. And then the two have to come to an agreement. The president nominates, and then the Congress approves nominees to the judicial branch. That's the Supreme Court. Okay. So the voters have two elections. You elect both Congress and the president, but you do so separately. And then, of course, the president nominates, essentially um, says, hey, this is the person I want. And Congress approves the judicial branch. And this is also a system around the world of government. Mexico has it, Nigeria has it. So there are some presidential systems that use this model as well. So, what happens in these systems is that there's actually things very specifically that each branch can do. Of course, the legislative branch makes law, that is the US Capitol, and that is Congress. The White House is the executive branch, and they enforce law, it's the president. And the interpretation of law is the judicial branch, and that is the Supreme Court. And that's the Supreme Court building. Okay. So, legislative branch is actually referenced in the Constitution in Article 1. So, everything in Article 1 is here's what Congress can do. The executive branch is in Article 2 of the Constitution. It says everything the president can do. And the judicial branch is in Article 3 that says everything that the judicial branch can do. So basically, all these things I'm about to tell you are things in the Constitution. This is what these groups are allowed to do, and they check and balance each other. Okay. So you're going to have these kind of like arrows. This is how they impact each other. So let's start with the legislative checks on the executive, Congress's checks on the president. Number one, they have a veto override. Remember, when a bill becomes a law, it has to go through the president. If the president says no to a bill, that's called a veto, then Congress, with two-thirds majority, can override that veto and the bill still becomes a law. Number two, Congress can declare war. This is to prevent the executive branch from becoming too powerful. However, there are still conflicts that arise. The last time the United States declared war was on December the 8th, 1941. Everything else has still been authorized by Congress, but a formal declaration of war hasn't happened for a very long time. Impeachment. Impeachment is the process of removing a member of the legislative or judicial branch. In this case, removing the president or a member of the Supreme Court. They can do so by impeachment. That's the removal process. The legislative can also check the judicial by approving the judges that the executive branch wants. And of course, as we already mentioned, can have a Supreme Court justice actually removed. Okay, let's talk about executive, the president checking the legislative, Congress. Number one, of course, is the use of a veto. A veto is saying no to a bill so it cannot become a law. Okay. Number two, they can ask Congress to war. They actually do the war. Remember, the commander in chief of the military is the president, but the money and the ability to the hey go you can go to war, that actually comes from Congress, but the holding of the war, the conducting of it, that actually comes out of the executive branch. They can propose laws. Remember, they can't write laws, and you'll often see the president proposes a budget's like that thick. It's a huge book, and people get all freaked out when the presidents propose their budgets, and they're like, "Oh my goodness, he wants." Da, 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 da." But the reality is, he knows it's a recommendation. It's not, because only Congress makes laws. He's just asking. Okay, what can Congress do to the Supreme Court? Well, they actually confirm judges. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. What can the president do to the Supreme Court? They appoint judges. Of course, Congress approves them. Okay. Now, judicial checks are really simple. Supreme Court, how do they check the other two powers? Well, they simply do what's called judicial review. They declare an act of the president or a law of Congress as unconstitutional. Okay, this is what's known as the an independent judiciary or an independent court. It means that it actually has the power to stop the president and Congress from doing an action that it would deem unconstitutional. And of course, they are appointed for life. And this is actually a check. So the Supreme Court doesn't have to worry about elections or politics. They can make their ruling done regardless of the president, regardless of the members of Congress. They have the ability to take care of business and call things unconstitutional for the rest of their life. How does a Supreme Court justice get out of their job? They retire, they die, or they are impeached, which means, an impeachment, you need to actually have evidence of a crime having been committed. All right. So here's the separation of powers: legislative, executive, judicial. And of course, they make law, enforce law, and interpret law. And then here's all the checks and balances on the different levels of government.